that Saki would finish the proofreading by the end of August, but I may have spoken a little too soon on that. It's a little more work than that, given her schedule and so forth. So, but I'm still expected to be out this year. So she had responded to that into Gurnisht, and he showed it to me, and I felt like I should say something. But otherwise, everything's good, and my health is much better now.
Great. Good.
So let's go ahead and take the questions.
Okay. Krishna Chaitanya. There we go.
Krishna, good morning.
Morning.
I'm coming through. Okay. I was reading Jaiva Dharma the other day, and a discussion was going on between was it Vijay Kumar and Goswami, and while they were discussing things about the gopis, a Vaishnav came in and an impersonalist came in, and it said that they stopped talking about what they were talking about because it was forbidden to talk about Rasakata while anyone with a male, who thought of themselves with a male body, was present. So they discussed small talk with the Vaishnav and the impersonalist, and then when they left, they resumed their discussion. And it just made me wonder just different considerations as far as talking about certain subject matters. I know they were talking about Madhurya Rasa in Gopi topics, and comparing, contrasting, talking about Sakya Rasa amongst people and these Gopi topics amongst certain people. What are your thoughts as far as like just discussing these things and where to draw the line on certain topics with certain
right. Well, I think one has to use their own discrimination, and times are different now. One thing that's different, for example, in terms of lines that my Guru Maharaj Prabhupada drew in his time, is that persons now getting involved have much more information available to them as to what Gaudiya Vaishnavism amounts to. The fact that there are other living, vital lineages, for example, outside of his own. There are books other than his own available in English, and so on and so forth. So, given that, for example, it would seem that that you could move that line from where he had drawn it, coming to America, for example, for the first time to talk to hippies and so on. So, one has to use their discrimination. Bhakti Vinod's drawing a particular line there. It would be interesting to read the Sanskrit. It might have said Purusha Bhav. You shouldn't talk about Gopi Bhav, but around those who are absorbed in Purusha Bhav. But you might have said male body. I didn't have to look at the Bengali, but I think it holds true, male or female, the bodily conception of life. Now it's kind of odd in that the other two were also spiritual people, and the Mayavadi was, I guess it was a Mayavadi in the group, Nvaitan. They're not thinking that their body, that they're the body, or that they're a male or a female. So exactly where he's drawing the line there, I'm not sure. But again, I mean, this is just a kind of a common sense thing, and if we don't have common sense, then we'll fail. That being, that in any kind of explanation of aspects of our philosophy, we have to determine the measure, in a broad sense at least, of the eligibility of those to whom we're talking, so that we speak to them at a level that they'll be able to benefit and digest and so forth, rather than go over their heads. And that's not just with regard, like I say, to Rasa Tattva, but the entirety of the the composite of Gaudiya philosophy. And to go back to Rasa Tattva in particular, well, that's the higher end, of the philosophy. And then one thing is to talk about that Rasa Tattva. Another thing is not to be talking about the Tattva, the underlying philosophy and theology of Bhakti Rasa, which is one thing, but to be speaking about Rasa itself, Lila Katha, and so on, which could sound to the uninformed like Gramya Katha, village talk, and be misunderstood. So, excuse me. When we get to that, exalted Vaishnavas speaking about the Leela per se, and that, as I say, more so than the underlying tattva. Well, the higher you go like that, that's the higher end. The less there are those who are qualified to participate in and take advantage of it. And it does also lend itself to being misunderstood readily because of its likeness in appearance to ordinary affairs of this world. I've often said that Vyasa in the Bhagavatam is walking a tightrope between Aishvarya and Madhurya, between the sweetness and the intimacy of the conception of Krishna and the fact that he's God. And he's trying to balance, to talk about the sweetness, and then you're going to find in the context that a couple of verses about the fact that he's God, even in the Leela chapters and so forth, to keep it in perspective. And then you've got 9 cantos building up to the 10th canto, and so on and so forth. So I think I can't give you an answer that you can only speak this much to this many people. And it's just a general principle. One has to use common sense, and it's you may misread the situation and find out that you're misreading the situation, and realize from the questions that people ask that you were over their head, and then you can come back and address it again. So it's hard to go wrong entirely, if you will, and some benefit would be there, I would suppose, in any event. But yeah, just some common sense. But I would, in general, say, as I did at the onstart of my answer, that where Prabhupada drew the line, if you will, was very much, and appropriately so, in consideration of the time and the circumstances. And the time and the circumstances have changed considerably now. And so there's a as I say, I wouldn't be intimidated by the line that he drew. And sometimes you get that kind of reaction, Even we wrote a book, we put together a book that was penned by Ashram Maharaj, Oh My Friend. And then some of the reaction that we got from some of Prabhupada's disciples were, we're not supposed to talk about that, The book was only about what Prabhupada said himself personally, and then reasoning, about the implications of it and so forth. And, we, on one particular subject about his own affinity for Sakya-rasa, all in one place. So those kind of cautions based on Prabhupada didn't talk about. Well, he did talk about it. He talked about it here, and there's distance between those things, and it wasn't his main emphasis, if you will. He didn't come out with it constantly in every lecture, like Krishna's tu Bhagavan Swayam, or you're not the body, and so on and so forth. But it's all there. And it would seem, at the time that we came out with it, was the appropriate time to come out with for a number of different reasons. So to voice those types of cautions and the line that Prabhupada drew and so on as a way of saying such book shouldn't be published or something like that is to misunderstand, I think, and not have exercise the kind of common sense that I'm speaking about. So hope that helps. Okay. Bye.
Okay, so John, you want to ask your question?
Yes, thank you, Didi. Dandavats Maharaj.
Well, anyway.
Following up a bit with a little dialogue that we had a couple of satsangs ago regarding Pujapad Srila Vrindavan Thakur Mahashai. Vrindavan Das Thakur.
Vrindavan Das Thakur. Good job.
Yes. I'm in the midst of the chapter about the glories of Murari Gupta, and Mahaprabhu is sitting with Murari Gupta and just having a perfectly wonderful time and joking with him and having this lovely exchange. And then, I quote, "Suddenly, the Lord's mood changed. He became angry, grinding his teeth loudly. He began to manifest his supreme identity. He said, a sannyasi named Prakasananda living in Kashi has the audacity to try and inflict pain upon my person. He is a teacher of Vedanta philosophy, but does not accept the existence of my supreme form. I have punished him by making tract leprosy, and yet he fails to understand." And this goes on a bit. So it feels, and now this particular passage is not found in other biographies of Mahaprabhu. Of course, there's such a delightful kind of exchange between Mahaprabhu and Prakasananda Sarasvati in the Caitanya-Caritamrta, which of course you know very well. So again, with a little bit of gentle and respectful complaint that one of our Param Gurus, Srila Vrindavan Das Thakur, it seems and feels as if, and this is not the only occasion, but throughout the book, especially in the Madhya, he appears to be presenting, the Supreme Lord as, the volatile, angry, unforgiving, God as presented or depicted in Judaism and Islam scriptures like that or teachings. So I just wanted to kind of get your take on that.
Well, I think that I'm not sure that is not mentioned anywhere else. Perhaps, and if it is, perhaps more briefly, Mahaprabhu making an outburst about Prakasananda Sarasvati.
But especially the part about punishing him with leprosy like that.
Well, yeah. And the statements are either from Caitanya-Bhagavata or other places. He says, I have no, I'm deaf, dumb, and blind. Because actually I'm Swami Bhagavan. I actually have eyes. I can see, I can talk. I'm not impersonal. I actually have an eternal form, which is the import of it all. And he's espousing a philosophy which in part or inherently can be construed to say that Bhagavan's form is illusory. It's only a manifestation of Sattva-guna. It's not eternal. His qualities aren't eternal. His leelas aren't eternal, and so forth. So that, to break that down, he's deaf, dumb, blind, and so forth. So those are the kind of remarks that I recall, and I'm not sure if he says that in Caitanya-Bhagavata, but I know it's said somewhat. But at any rate, I think that in one sense you have to look at it philosophically, and there's a strong statement by an acharya, it wouldn't be the only one, in opposition to a position taken by the Mayavad school with regard to the eternality of Krishna's form, Leela, pastimes, and so forth. An objection to that. And here Bhagavan himself is expressing that objection. And I don't recall that where the encounter between Prakasananda and Chaitanya Mahaprabhu is described in Caitanya-Caritamrta, that Prakasananda is described as having leprosy. So you'd think it would be. But I don't know. I would say, in the least, that these acharyas in their time and their circumstances have taken the liberty to express things rather strongly at times in their narratives of Chaitanya's life, in which they're trying to present a particular his Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's philosophy, and which doesn't match up with some of the other teachings out and about at the time, and that they're in opposition to, that are, you could be more polite about it, I suppose, but I suppose that you could characterize the Mayavad school in that way as being more polite and more indirect in what they say in terms of what the implications of it are. Just like, I'll give you an example. In the Mayavad school, it said, we accept all the different schools. In fact, we may even know the teachings of the school better than some of the teachers in those schools, because we're jnanis. We study very carefully. They can be more schooled in Jiva Goswami's teaching than many Gaudiya Vaishnavas can. So they embrace all the schools. It's looked at as here's this really broad, accommodating, pluralistic perspective, right? All the schools are just different ways of expressing or pursuing, expressing something about the absolute in pursuance of attaining transcendence through the different culture, language, and so forth. Whether it be the Sufis, or whether it be the Gaudiyas, or the Ramanujas, or the mystic Christians, they're all saying something different, but they're actually all saying something the same. And so it sounds very broad and accommodating and very, very nice. But what they're actually saying is that however, if you look carefully, what these schools are saying about the nature of transcendence is all wrong. So because the Gaudiyas say that their sadhana is their sadhya. So they're doing bhakti and worship, for example, in sadhana, and bhakti and worship continues in transcendence. But in the Mayavad school, all these different paths that they seem to be accommodating of, they're radically opposed to the conclusions of these schools themselves, none of which say our school ends in an impersonal, if you will, indeterminate identification with, merging with an indeterminate substance. I mean, that's not what the Christians are teaching. That's not what the Gaudis do. Not what the Ramanujas or the Madhvas are teaching, and so forth. So it sounds very accommodating, but if you look very carefully, that as Gaudis have, they find it to be rather insidious. Therefore, Mahaprabhu said in Caitanya-Caritamrta, in the paraphrasing, if you will, in poetic paraphrasing of Pujapad Sridhar Maharaj, that half truth is worse than no truth at all. In other words, this is in regard to the Buddhists compared to the Mayavadins. The Buddhists often come out and say there is no God. The Mayavadis say there is, but he's not eternal, and it doesn't have a form, and so on and so forth. So half truth is worse than no truth at all. So that they do take, considerable, many Gaudis. Vrindavan Das, Caitanya-Caritamrta is very strident in its opposition to Advaita, outwardly giving examples and so forth. Now, the Goswamis, Jiva Goswami, Sanatana Goswami, they're more subtle about it, but still. So, they look at it like, hey, you're throwing the first stone. they're the Mayavads. I mean, to give you an example, in Caitanya-Caritamrta, Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami says, the teaching of Shankar, in the section that you're speaking about, when Mahaprabhu was speaking with Prakasananda Sarasvati, that your teacher Shankar is saying that Vyasa doesn't know what he's talking about. Let me explain what he's actually saying. Because the idea of the two tiers of Brahman, what is this term? You have the indeterminate Brahman, then you have the determinate Brahman. The determinate Brahman being a manifestation of Sattva-guna, and just something to focus on in the interim until you attain the nirguna, in indeterminate absolute. This idea of Shankar's has no place in the sutras itself. He adds that in, I think, in the 18th, his commentary on the 18th sloka, or verse, it's a sutra, I say, of the first very first chapter of Vedanta Sutra. So it's rather crude language if you look at it. He said, your teacher is teaching that Vyasa didn't know what he was, Vyasa Branta means like crazy, didn't know what he was talking about. And I'm here to tell you, what it should be. So, they take pretty strong position against that. And one of the reasons is that, well, the Mayavad idea is contrary to devotion in both in its in terms of what the ideal is, and in terms of the path as well. So it's kind of like clear in the forest. Prabhupada was very strong about this point too. If you want to grow, turn forest land into pasture and agricultural land, well, you have to chop down some trees and so forth. But it's not, again, that the Mayavad school is they may say it in a more polite way, but it's rather insidious at the same time to say, your goal, what you say is an illusion. It doesn't exist. If they come out and say it in that language, you might take exception to it. They don't say it exactly like that, but that is the implication of it. So that said, in the time of Caitanya-Bhagavata, Vrindavan Das, reacted in that way. Now, in our times, we may react differently and say it more politely. Depict Chaitanya Mahaprabhu to be like the God of the Old Testament, I don't think so. I think that here he is, ecstatic in relationship with Murari Gupta. Imagine what their conversation was. And he's overwhelmed by a bhava. It has to do with his dispensation and the other aspect of what he's about. He's there to establish the Yuga Dharma and the teaching, and he's also there to experience ultimately, Radha Bhav, to taste the highest reach of rasa. So this other side comes on to him, and in a Bhav, he expresses some let's say displeasure with that kind of teaching, and predicts, that he will go there, and what did he do? So you have to look at the whole thing. You have to play the whole thing out. When Mahaprabhu went there, how did he act? He may have said something, like I may say something, that son of a, when I'm talking to you, that guy, but then if I'm going to talk to him, actually, I'm going to say it differently, and I'm going to try to accomplish my goal of showing him that his opinion is wrong, and so on and so forth. So in an intimate circle, which you described Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was in, he might say it one way, but when he went there and talked to Prakasananda Sarasvati, he sat down at the door where the sannyasins washed their feet, and washed the feet of the Mayavadi sannyasins when they came in. And he conquered, actually, Prakasananda Sarasvati by his humility.
Yes. By
his humility, he created a teaching moment that allowed Prakasananda Sarasvati to be eager to hear from him what his teaching was. While in the meantime, in Benares, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was doing Sankirtan, and Prakasananda Saraswati in the background was criticizing, who is this sannyasi from Bengal? He's coming here dancing, and this is not the way of the sannyasi.
Right.
Reported to Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. Yeah. So when Mahaprabhu was on the scene, how he related to Prakasananda Saraswati, that has to be taken all into consideration. So I think you have to look at it like that. Again, in an intimate circle, he may say one thing, and how he does when he's there, is another thing. And he converted Prakasananda Saraswati as it's related in Caitanya-Caritamrta, after having created a philosophical or teaching moment by responding with Vedanta and saying, the real Mahabhakya is not Tatvamasi, it's Om Pranava Omkar. This is the implication of Omkar is Achintya Veda Veda, is basically what he explained there. So you have to look at the whole picture. You and yourself may do the same thing as there, or I may do the same thing. I may react in an intimate circle. I hear somebody has said something, and like somebody says, there are all kinds of things people say these days in the world, and within Gaudiya Vaishnavism as well. But even in the world, some crazy people have some very crazy ideas, and you might speak strongly about them. But then if you were to go and talk with them and try to change their mind, then another mood would surface. So God has many moods. That's the answer.
Yeah, sure.
Unfortunately, the God in the Old Testament seems to only have one.
Exactly. See, that was so. I guess the very main point for me in this wonderful exposition that you just so kindly gave is that Mahaprabhu. It is likely that Mahaprabhu did not really give leprosy to Prakasananda Saraswati. It was just a poetic kind of expression on the part of Srila Vrindavan Das Thakur in order to convey a certain...
Yeah. They take that kind of license. Those books are written with that kind of license taken.
Okay.
To make a point. Yeah. And, that's, of course, part of Vaishnavism. Angers can also be included. Hanuman was angry and, in the service of Ram at Ravana, and built the bridge that he could. So there's a place for it, which is a very interesting, concept. Okay, good.
Yes, thank you, Maharaj. Thank you so much.
Prakasananda ki jai. Murari Gupta ki jai. Vrindavan Das Thakur ki jai.
Jai.
Sajjana ki jai.
Ganga Shakti, wanna?
Gashakti ki jai. Arjun ki jai. Yes, Ganga Shakti, question.
Hare
Answer.
Krishna Guru Maharaj Dandavat Pranam. I was wondering about this notion of Dharmakshetra, Kuruksetra in the first verse of Bhagavad Gita, and rather why exactly they decided to do that big war exactly on a place for pilgrimage, a place for religious rituals. I have always known that verse, but I was recently wondering why exactly the whole war happened on exactly that place.
Well, I think the idea there is that what the war is a determining as to what Dharma ultimately is. I mean, you can look at it as a literal war, or you could look at it more in terms of a war on the ego, the illusory ego or identification with matter that causes us to think in terms of I and mine, which is expressed by Dhritarashtra in that verse. What did my sons and the sons of Pandu do? This is and so that's what the book's about, and it's Krishna declares war on the ego, and Arjuna is reticent to participate in the war, given that he's going to have to fight against even his own teachers. Krishna brings the chariot up between the two armies and parks it right in front of Bhishma and Dronacharya, the elder and teacher, respectively, of Arjuna, and you're going to have to slay them. And so the implication is that he's going to have to slay his attachments. So it's really, I think, to be looked at along those lines. That's the teaching. The literal war, how many people were killed, how many heads were cut off, and so on and so forth is not so important. There is often an emphasis that there was a real war, it really happened like this many people died, and so on and so forth. And there's a place to make that kind of emphasis. And I think in terms of Prabhupada's own emphasis in that regard, what he felt was there's a place for this, because if we just start to talk about it metaphorically, then there's the chance that the whole idea that Krishna is just a metaphor and this is just a myth to give a lesson and so forth, is you crack the door to that. And he didn't want to do that. And so he would say things like, when asked, what is the implication of the 5 horses? And he would say, it takes 5 horses to pull a chariot, He would give a literal kind of explanation. But his literal explanation was in pursuit of the very, very esoteric idea that God has form. When form, in our experience and in the teaching, materially speaking, is a limitation, it's provincial, gives us a provincial perspective rather than a universal perspective, and so on and so forth. So it's a very esoteric idea to find form in transcendence after being taught of the limitations of form, materially speaking. So rather than underscoring the philosophical, theological implications, which he did to some extent, as to Leela, why there's a need for Leela, why there must be movement in transcendence in order for there to be the full face of love and so forth. You could speak about that in very broad theological terms rather than in more specific terms of details of like you could take rather than seeing the Leela as a metaphor, to see it as an ontic reality that it actually exists, is one thing. But then to say that it's more than what's there in the book. In other words, to talk about Leela is as an ontological reality is one thing. Like if as long as my metaphysic is a Chintu Beta Beta, then I can interpret the Leela and take metaphorical meanings from it and so forth, and speak more about what the implication is, that there is a situation in transcendence that involves an interaction that we could call love, movement between the Atma and the Paramatma. I mean, that's a very broad way of speaking about it. And you can do that theologically and so on and so forth. And then you can also take the specifics, narratives of the Leela and interpret them non-literally, if you will, if your metaphysic is something like a Chintu Beta Beta, without doing away with the ontic status of the Leela itself. But Prabhupada wasn't so much doing that. He was just kind of emphasizing the ontic status of the Leela and speaking about it in a literal way, which had its value at that time. I can tell you, it was very helpful to us. But again, there is a place for, and looking, for example, the Leela of the Bhagavad Gita as a battle for that life is about. I mean, what's life about? What's the world about? That's what is the meaning of life and its purpose, and what meaning do you get from the symbols and signs of nature that doesn't talk? Nature is not limited by language, which is limited by logic, because you have a subject and an object, you have past, present, and future. Language was evolved, if you want to look at from a Darwinian perspective, to protect people. There's a tiger over there. A way of talking about it. You can get fruit at that tree over there. It wasn't evolved to explain the whole truth of reality, which transcends the limits of logic and the limits of language. Now, so nature, in a sense, is the Paramatma thinking. The thoughts of the Paramatma are manifest as what we call the external world. Now, scientific materialism doesn't look at it like that, but they're wrong. It's the thoughts of God. They have a shape, and the whole world is speaking to us symbolically. That's why humanity's disconnect with nature is such an existential problem for humanity. So, if we listen to nature carefully, if we get out of our head, reflect enough to get out of our head and understand the limits of thought and the limits of logic in terms of capturing the truth. What did Gödel, that mathematicians say, proof is not truth. Proof is not truth. Logical proofs don't amount to what the truth is. You cannot, that just doesn't match up. Tarko Pratishtana, we say it in the Vedanta Sutra. Logic is not sufficient to capture the nature of reality. So there have to be other ways to read, if you will. And so, of course, that's what the whole Varnashram is about. How to interact with the world and nature, the sun, the wind, the moon, the tree, and so forth, in such a way that what the message that's embedded in nature can be intuited and understood by revering aspects of nature that we're dependent upon, that our senses are dependent upon in order to function as we like them to see, to taste, and so forth, to show gratitude to to the macrocosm by which that becomes possible, then in effect, the macrocosm, nature, begins to speak to them. We begin to speak the language now through worship. It's through worship and the symbolic way of sacrifice and I want to say worship again, that you find in Varnashram, which is everywhere. It's like gratitude everywhere, worship everywhere. Face this direction, do it that, worship that way. Face this direction, not that, and do it this way over here. This is supposed to get nature to talk to you, and nature's ultimate, the message to you is twofold. The message is that you are my soul. You are the soul of the whole thing. You, and two, you have a source, and all the gods and all the goddesses, if you will, this is what they're saying. These are all agents, right? Higher agent. They're all speaking like this through nature. You can't. Why can't we see them? Because you don't friggin' speak the language, for God's sake, and you're not interested in learning it either, because you're so intoxicated by rational thought, which is so impoverished. Rational thought. I mean, what is reason? And logic. What is logic? Logic, from an Aristotelian point of view, is about 5 or 6 axioms that you believe in. You can't prove them, because to prove them would be circular, because you're going to prove logic by logic. That doesn't work. So what logic is a belief in certain axioms. But even Aristotelian logic, there's other logic within mathematics that dismisses some of the axioms of Aristotelian logic that don't apply. So the idea is there's something beyond logic, beyond the head. And in order to get there, you can use the head to an extent, but not unto itself. That will be counterproductive. Therefore, I often say, if you use the head to soften the heart, you have to come to trans-rational exercises, if you will. So the whole Varnashram is about trying to communicate with nature, to read what the mind of God in the form of nature is saying to us. And again, it's twofold. You're a soul, and you have a source, and he's supreme even to us. Now, we can't do Varnashram very well because the circumstances in the world being what they are, and we're born outside of it, this and that. We're fortunate to have sadhu sangha. We get right to the point, right? But in getting right to the point that you're the soul, and there's a source, there's a supreme soul, and so forth. We have to be careful not to do that, or attempt to do that in a less than fully organic way, which you do arrive at gradually through the system of Varnashram. Therefore, it said first inquire about Dharma, now inquire about Brahman, now is the time to inquire about Rasa, right? Dharma Tato, Dharma Jignasu, the first part of the Vedas say. After that's done, now Tato, Brahma Jignasu, then Rasa Jignasu. So, but we're going Rasa Jignasu right from the start. That's the value of sadhu sangha, but we need a lot of it, and good sadhu sangha, so that we actually imbibe it in an organic way and understand where we are in it all, and how high it is, and we don't misconstrue it, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, I'm getting a little away from your question in a sense, but some thoughts I've been pondering, sitting here close to nature as I do at Audarya and listening. So music, art, and these are not logical ways of knowing, but they're ways of getting like an insight, of cracking the door. There's something more. What speak of actual, if you get the message, sadhana, this is like opening the door. These are way for actually opening the door and seeing the other side over there. And what can you say about it? So, the Bhagavad Gita's attempt to say something about it. The narrative is in the context of Mahabharata, where there's a big war building up, right? And it's like building up chapter after chapter. Is it going to happen? And there's a diplomacy. And finally, it's not going to happen. The author of the Mahabharata's got everybody on the edge of their seat. Like, the war is going to happen. All this political intrigue, romance, and everything that everybody's absorbed in materially. It's been talked about from on and on. And here, now the war is going to happen. And what comes out, ahimsa. Krishna says this is one of the, aspects of knowledge, and so and love is the doctrine here that's being taught, So that's all very appropriate at the Dharma Kshetra, the place of where Dharma is to be, has been performed or taught in other levels. Now Krishna is going to teach it personally, and he's going to teach ultimately about Prema Dharma to Arjuna, as I emphasize in my edition of the Gita. And so why not have a war there, at least metaphorically speaking, you could say, or, you could say literally as well. It's a good place to have it, given the fact that it's being used as an opportunity to explain these teachings to Arjuna. So those are some thoughts. Hope that helps. Bhagavad Gita ki jai, Kuruksetra ki jai.
I have a question. I was having a discussion with some devotees the other day about relative and absolute statements in scripture. And I was wondering, would it be accurate? I mean, I said this, and that many of the statements that describe or define the configuration of matter in the world are relative, since matter is mutable and ever changing. Would that be an accurate statement?
Yeah, I think that that's true. And I think that, matter was explored in the time of, let's say, the Bhagavad Gita was written from a certain perspective, and with certain instruments. The perspective, all important, was, as I often say, what's out there and who's asking the question, with an emphasis on who's asking the question. When the emphasis on who's asking the question, then the details of what's out there are not as important as the overriding or picture of matter being illusory and a veiling influence. So the teaching is what's in there is an Atma, consciousness, transcendent to time and space. And consciousness is that, it's not a thing, it's that which all things appear within. It's fundamental. It's the most fundamental thing. Time and space are not fundamental. Consciousness is fundamental. And so this being the emphasis, and that reality about the self, which explains the self to be much more expansive and have much greater potential than the conventional sense of self, which is one that's veiled by the outer world, overshadowed by the influence of the outer world. And therefore, the purpose of life is to come out from underneath that shadow and be, all that you are, all that you can possibly be, right? Given that understanding and that emphasis, it's understandable that you're not driven by a necessity to find out all the details of exactly what's the speed of light. Now, in modern society, since scientific revolution, then since that time, till today, there's been this building on exploring the details of what's out there, and great, and they have created instruments that are extraordinary for being able to do so. Go into the atom and go to to the outer space and explore and so forth. So they're going to come up with more detailed explanation of how it works, so to speak, than you're going to find in the Bhagavatam, for example. But the explanation of the outer world, at the same time, matter in the Bhagavatam is more comprehensive than modern explanation of what matter is, which there is no explanation. All that science does and has been doing, continues to do, is explain if you press down here and over here, it comes up over there. Okay, give that to technology and make something out of it. Cool. That's what goes on. It tells us how nature works, how matter works in certain circumstances. It doesn't tell us anything about what it is. What it is, ultimately. And what it is in a word is said, in 2 syllables, Maya. It's not what it appears to be. And we only have a perception of what it is. We can't get away from that. You can't get to the virgin nature of matter. It's just not possible. Of course, we'll say ultimately matter is as I said, the mind of God expressed. It's kind of an idealism, of sorts. It's not the idealism of that one individual mind is everything, and if it doesn't think about it, it didn't happen. It's not, that problem slopism is not what we're talking about. There's a universal mind. Now that said, you can also look in a broad way at things that are said in the Bhagavad, for example, about nature and matter, and what's said in the scientific community, and you can find some correlation. Like, for example, in theoretical physics, it's been demonstrated that if a physical system is observed from a certain angle, it will function in certain measurements. Certain measurements will come out of that. If the same one is looked at from another direction, other measurements will come out of it that contradict those. And so it depends who's looking at it, how it responds. Now, there's a debate within modern science, physics, as to what constitutes an observer. Does it have to be a mind, or could it be instrument? And there's a very good arguments for, it's actually a mind, it's consciousness, has to be an observer. Now, it's not that our mind observes and therefore something is or it's not, but there is a universal mind, right? That's God. And what does the Bhagavatam say? What does the Upanishad say? Saikshata. He looked at it, and there it was. In other words, even modern science says in physics that without an observer, it's not there. It is the observation. There is something called matter, and it manifests as we know it by being looked at. Some things only happen if you look at them. If someone's looking at them, otherwise they don't happen. If someone's looking at you, you might act a certain way that you don't otherwise. So Bhagavatam says he looks, he glances. This is a very profound insight, just recently discovered, in modern science through experimentation, that observer has a significant role in terms of what's out there. But again, this is the Bhagavatam speaking in broad ways that are significant, that make its explanation of matter more comprehensive than the detailed explanations of matter that we get from modern science that says this is this far away, this is the speed of light. Like take Einstein, he took his main thing to discover the speed of light, right? I guess what it was. But he said, I tried to do this my whole life. I figured it out, but I don't know what light is. I know what a speed is, but I don't even know what it is, what light is. He said that. So the Bhagavatam comes to answer and said, see, you cannot know it. You can know so many things about it. And that could change too. Depends who's looking or what angle you look at it from or what universe it's going on and so forth. So Newton said, and he's right, we all stand on the shore like a child playing with seashells of the ocean of truth. This is a guy who knew something, scientifically speaking. Newton, he's a giant, a giant in physics. And this is what he said. So, who cares for these guys who so proud of their, understanding that they've done away with themselves in the context of, explaining the world, done away with, they've made it, a desert in terms of meaning. It's just, there's no, this is materialism, which, prides itself in conjunction as a comprehensive philosophy. Of course, it's not in any way, but modern science, it collects information, it puts it in the hands of technicians, and they do things with it that are far out and that haven't been done before. But does it mean we know the meaning of life from that? No. So I'm going on. I'm sorry, but yeah, you're right to take that kind of position. There wasn't an interest. If your main interest is who's in there asking the question, well then, does it matter what the speed of light is? Do we have to go fly that high in the sky to know the meaning of life? Do we have to fly to the moon to find out who we are? Which is the bigger question. Not how far the moon is. What are people doing there? Well, figure out who you are here, why you're here, what the purpose is. Maybe I'll focus on that. So the whole thing is like, great, you're going here, there, and everywhere faster, and communicating and finding out this, that, and the other thing. It has some relative value and so forth, but it may, for that matter, get in the way of knowing the truth. Let's take Darwinian. We talk about science, Darwinian evolution. So if you look at evolution, the very theory of evolution, it in no way says to us that human beings are evolving in such a way as to know the whole truth. It doesn't say that at all. It says you're evolving in such a way as to know how to survive. Knowing how to survive and avoid death for as long as you can is not about understanding the whole picture of reality. It's even if you accept the evolutionary thesis and so forth, well, it's a very limited thing what it's saying. It's interesting, but it's kind of dumb too. Species adapt according to circumstances to survive. Okay, I do that. I adapt. Circumstances changed. I left this gun. I adapted. I'm still alive. So we have experience of that. Now, but to make more out of it, it's nothing about. There's nothing in evolution about that we're evolving. And the whole function of evolution is that we're going to know the whole truth. No, that's not what it's saying at all. So these are all distractions in a sense. They're distractions. They're useful distractions, relatively speaking, but they don't have to be entirely distractions. It's good to make life easier in some respects if the time that's gained from it is used meaningfully to pursue what reality is. I mean, it's billed as pursuing what reality is, but it's modern science and materialism, but it's based on the premise that reality is only material things, only matter, only physical things. Well, great. That doesn't make any sense. There's no feeling, there's no emotion, there's no, those are all illusory and unreal. Anyway, that's a whole other thing. Materialism is a failed philosophy, and you will see it in due course. It's already happening right now. There's a paradigm shift is taking place. I can tell you. I told you this before. Science was born as a Christian. In its boyhood, it became agnostic, and in its adolescence, in its adulthood, it became an atheist. If it's going to live to old age, it has to become a mystic. Now you're going to find more and more people invested in a scientific and modern philosophical approach to understanding the nature of reality are going to just throw up their hands with this idea of trying to make matter everything. It just does not work. I mean, there's an objective and subjective aspects of life. Why you want to do away with one? If you want to do away with one, do away with the objective one. That makes more sense than the subjective one. These are two aspects of life. Anyway, and you can't make experience out of non-experience. And we have experience. That's what the whole thing's about. As I said, consciousness is that in which all things are found. It's not a thing inside of time and space. No, time and space are found inside of consciousness. They're ideas, actually. Even I'll tell you another thing. In modern physics, it's already, this is an example of how the paradigm shift is starting to happen. That it's starting to be understood. It is understood, but it's not talked about that much. That time and space are not the fundamental reality. This has been the thinking for a long time. Time and space are the fundamental reality. There's nothing beneath or beyond that. That is false. That has been demonstrated to be false. Time and space are not the fundamental reality. So where do we go from there? Oh, we can try to find, well, why not consciousness is the fundamental reality? That's an interesting idea. So anyway, sorry for going off on it with your question, but yeah, I think it was good what way you explained that.
It reminds me of the story you tell about Prabhupada when they asked him how many windows were in the Empire State Building. And
what did he say?
He said as many drops of water as there are in an illusion.
Yeah.
And then you have to see that the Empire State Building doesn't even exist anymore.
Yeah.
About even, more of a confirmation of Prabhupada's wisdom.
All right. Well, we're going a little over time.
Yeah, well, thank you so much.
Sorry if I didn't get some of the questions, but
we had a couple more, but we'll come next week and you guys will get first in line if you're still interested in asking a question. And we'll see you on Thursday, right?
What's Thursday?
Balaram's appearance day.
It's Thursday?
I think so. Thursday. The
What's
11th.
the date?
The 11th.
Balaram Purim Ki Jai.
Jai.
Hare
So
Bol.
see you Thursday, 11:30, same time, everyone. Hare Krishna.
Jai.
Jai. Hare Bol.